Part 32. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 311. At this time, Qing Shi also seemed to feel the terrifying aspect of Lin Yu at this moment. There was quite a bit of fear in his eyes. At this time, he subconsciously took a few steps back. But the green lion stepped back, and Lin Yu just moved forward. After a moment, the green lion couldn't bear it any longer, and began to roar angrily at Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu stepped forward again, and then the green lion, overwhelmed by Lin Yu's momentum, actually began to lie down. After all, he was also the legendary Lord of Reincarnation. How could Qing Shi's mere momentum be compared to Lin Yu's? After waiting for a while, Lin Yu's lips curled into a sneer, and his eyes flashed with a hint of ridicule. He just waved it casually. "You'd better not be so arrogant in front of me." At this time, Lin Yu said in a cold voice, with a completely gloomy look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Jushin Huanyu seemed to be intimidated by Lin Yu's aura. Then, he let out a long cry that echoed through the sky, and then he waved his wings towards Lin Yu. "Here, a violent attack is coming." The Nine Heavens fantasy feather was extremely fast, and in just a blink of an eye, it was already in front of Lin Yu. At this moment, a sneer appeared on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth. At this time, he heard Lin Yu spit out 3 words from his mouth, "Ho Lu Yu." Then, He Lu Yu directly stood in front of Lin Yu. The king of Guzhu had seen this before, and He Lu Yu was not surprised at all. However, after King Zhou Yu saw this He Lu Yu, his pupils suddenly brightened. It grew bigger, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. "Interesting, this little guy is very interesting. I didn't expect you to own such a strange beast in the wild. This is something I didn't expect." King Zhou Yu said in a cold and unhurried voice, with a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. But when Lin Yu heard this, after King Zhou Yu said this, a bit of contempt flashed in his eyes, and a bit of a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "There are still many things you don't know, and the reason is just because of your ignorance." Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly like this, with a sense of ridicule in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, after King Zhou Yu heard what Lin Yu said, his face instantly turned ugly. At this moment, his eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, and a murderous intention erupted from him. It began to spread in his body. That gloomy murderous aura actually made Lin Yu feel a little dazed. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Zhou Yu, and something strange flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. "Color. You must have sold your soul to those alien beasts a long time ago. If not, how could you have obtained this evil clan's method?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at King Zhou Yu, with a slight sneer on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of mockery. After King Zhou Yu heard what Lin Yu said, he also laughed like this, with a completely gloomy look in the corners of his eyes and brows. "I didn't expect it. What I never expected was that you could actually see it. It's a pity, it's a pity, it's a pity. What can you do even if you can see it? You are no match for me. Give up and accept it. Death is the only choice for you two now." After the king of Guzhu heard what Lin Yu said, even though he had endless longevity, the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with confusion. He couldn't understand what Lin Yu was doing. At this time, King Guzhu's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu, and then he frowned slightly. "What is going on? What do you mean by this?" When Lin Yu heard King Guzhu say this, a faint smile appeared on his lips, and then he turned around and glanced at King Guzhu. "Don't you know what it means to sell your soul to the evil tribe?" At this time, the king of Guzhu also shook his head like this. Looking at him like this, it seemed that he really didn't know what was going on. After Lin Yu saw this scene, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. "In that case, okay, let me tell you what it means to sell your soul to the evil tribe. Actually, it's very simple, because the evil beasts of the evil tribe have been passed down for a long time, and all the evil beasts are composed of alien beasts. The alien beasts have endless lifespans. They were spread in ancient times, so what they know and understand is also extremely wide. So they have many magic methods that we don't know about. Presumably your brother knows this formation because he sold his soul to the evil clan and made a deal with them. At this time, King Guzhu's eyes were full of surprise. His eyes were staring at King Zhou, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Brother, why are you doing this? Why do you do this? At this time, King Zhou couldn't help laughing after hearing what King Guzhu said. At this time, his eyes and brows were filled with a look of madness. Boy, I am not your brother now. I am the most loyal servant of His Majesty the evil Emperor. You bastards who rule strange beasts should all die. After King Zhou said this, his face began to become more and more gloomy, and the madness in the corners of his eyes and brows became more and more obvious. After King Guzhu saw this scene, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a look of helplessness appeared on his face. Then what should we do now? My brother has become like this now, I'm afraid. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Guzhu King said, he just shook his head and smiled. It doesn't matter, I have a solution. After the king of Guzhu heard what Lin Yu said, his eyes were full of anticipation. At this moment, he seemed to have grasped the life-saving straw. Is there a way? If there is any way, let's talk about it first. Lin Yu just smiled like this. The evil clan's method is nothing more than to shackle people's souls, and there are very few soul skills, so few people open them. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Shengchong. Chapter 312. King Zhou also heard what Lin Yu told King Guzhu. At this time, King Zhou had a sneer on his lips, and a hint of ridicule flashed in his eyes. Interesting, it's really interesting. Even if you know that my soul has been dedicated to my lord, what will happen? Now that you can't escape, you should just obediently use your power to make my wife. At this time, King Guzhu heard what King Zhou said, and the expression on his face began to become a little more panicked than before. But is there a way to crack it or not? If my brother continues like this, I'm afraid both of us will die here. King Guzhu turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu, with a hint of anxiety flashing in his eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Guzhu King said, his eyes narrowed to a slit, and a special color flashed in his eyes. Everyone will die here. That's not necessarily the case. Although he is feeding on people's souls, what if the power of the souls is strong enough? At this time, after King Zhou heard what Lin Yu said, there was a hint of ridicule in the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of contempt. Little guy, who do you think you are? How dare you say that the soul is powerful enough? This is simply ridiculous. At this time, King Zhou said, and he actually laughed like this. At this time, King Zhou's face was filled with a smile. Ha ha ha. King Yu laughed heartily this week. At this time, he seemed to be the winner who had already won. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of ridicule. This guy is so complacent. People are most likely to make mistakes when they are most complacent. King Zhou obviously didn't think there was anything Lin Yu could do, but the next second, King Zhou was completely stunned. Because behind Lin Yu, a huge white tiger slowly walked towards King Zhou. You must know that King Zhou has seen a lot of strange beasts in this ancient world, but it is true that King Zhou rarely sees strange beasts with such a strong sense of oppression. The white tiger, it's actually a white tiger. How could you possibly tame the white tiger? Didn't the white tiger disappear as early as 3,000 years ago? Since then, people have never seen the white tiger again, but now this little guy. At this time, Lin Yu just turned around and glared at the man fiercely. Stop talking nonsense, I have something to ask you. After King Zhou saw the white tiger, the expression on his face was no longer as crazy as before. At this time, a bit of seriousness flashed across his face. King Zhou's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and after a long while, he spoke slowly. Who the hell are you? At this time, King Zhou's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. You don't have to worry about who I am, you only need to know one thing, and that's fine. What happened? You can't be too mean and shameless, just like you are now. As Lin Yu spoke, he waved his hand slightly in front, and the white tiger suddenly swooped towards the Jushin Xuanyu. Finally, Jushin Xuanyu retreated backwards very quickly, with a kind of panic in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, after King Zhou saw this scene, his face also began to change. It became gradually ugly. He took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. At this time, Lin Yu was staring at King Zhou with a smile on his face. The corners of his eyes and brows were full of mockery, and the corners of his mouth were even more sneered. The murderous intention spread on his body. And out. Do you have anything else to say now? Just a reminder, it's best to think carefully before speaking, because if you are not careful, it may become your last words. At this time, Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly, with a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and brows, and a slight sneer on the corners of his mouth. After King Zhou saw the scene again, he was naturally extremely angry. At this time, his fists clenched loudly, and the murderous intention on his body quietly came out, and his eyes stared straight into his eyes. He stared hard at Lin Yu, and then he spoke through gritted teeth. Boy, who do you think you are? Are you worthy of threatening me? At this time, after Lin Yu heard what King Zhou said, a somewhat sarcastic smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then a hint of ridicule flashed in his eyes. Whether you deserve it or not, it's not up to you to decide, it's up to me. Lin Yu said in a cold voice through gritted teeth. He turned around and stared directly at King Zhou. King Zhou's back felt cold. King Zhou never expected that the little guy in front of him looked ordinary, but in fact he had such abilities. At this time, King Zhou turned his head, glanced at Lin Yu, and then smiled like this. He smiled happily, as if he had encountered the most happy thing in the world. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face condensed slightly, and he turned his head and stared at King Zhou, with a gloomy look in his eyes. What are you laughing at? Is it so funny? Lin Yu said in a deep voice. After hearing what Lin Yu said, King Zhou turned his head and glanced at him coldly, with a cold light on his face, and the murderous intent on his body quietly emerged. What do you think? The two looked at each other, and even a burst of fierce sparks broke out in the void. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly flashed forward, and then rushed directly in front of King Zhou. The corners of King Zhou's mouth just raised a few sneers, 10,000 swords gather. And then, countless sword spirits suddenly appeared around Zhu Tianxianyu. Those sword spirits floating around Zhu Tianxianyu gave people a natural and terrifying pressure, which made people feel a chill. The feeling was mysterious, giving people an indescribable meaning. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 313. At this time, Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, he suddenly smiled, and then he shook his head with a smile. Interesting, this is really interesting, but I'm afraid it's still a bit difficult to deal with me. Regardless of anything else, in terms of realm alone, this white tiger is many times more powerful than Jushin Xuanyu, so Lin Yu is naturally not afraid of this at this time. At this moment, Jushin Swanyu seemed to have noticed the terror and horror of the white tiger. At this moment, Jushin Swanyu was faintly trembling, and there was a kind of panic in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Meaning. At this time, King Joyu seemed to have noticed this. A bit of fierce murderous aura flashed in his eyes, and murderous intent was everywhere in his body. Hair. King Joyu just said coldly, and then the thousands of flying feathers rushed straight up, and then they rushed towards Lin Yu's face like this crazily. In just a blink of an eye, these thousands of flying feathers landed in front of Lin Yu at the same time. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu only had a teasing smile at the corner of his mouth, and then tightened his grip. Then he just shook his head. I thought you were really capable of this, but it turns out it's nothing more than that. You're trying to block the car with your hands. I think you're really overestimating your capabilities. At this time, Lin Yu said coldly. After King Joyu heard what Lin Yu said, his expression suddenly darkened, and then he glanced at Lin Yu coldly, with a bit of coldness flashing in his eyes. Mang, the corner of his mouth evoked a hint of sneer. Little guy, you really have a tough mouth like a boiled duck. If you want to seek death, then if I don't help you, you're really going to be in trouble. You just have to die here today. After King Joyu finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu. His speed was extremely fast. In just a moment, he was already in front of Lin Yu. Then he saw King Yu of Zhou, who didn't know when he had a dagger in his hand. At this moment, it was soldiers versus soldiers, Jushin Swanyu versus Baihu, and King Yu of Zhou versus Lin Yu. However, there was no trace of panic on Lin Yu's face. He just turned slightly to the side, and then he dodged the attack from King Joyu, and then he saw him turn around. His foot kicked directly into King Joyu's lower abdomen. At this moment, King Joyu flew backwards. In the end, King Joyu fell heavily to the ground. He only felt a sweetness in his throat, and then the blood in his mouth fell. It squirted out so completely. At this time, Lin Yu slowly walked towards King Joyu. He smiled and shook his head, with a hint of ridicule flashing in his eyes. It seems like your strength isn't that great either? I originally thought you had some abilities, but now it seems like nothing more than that. At this time, Lin Yu was talking coldly and unhurriedly. After a moment, King Joyu's face condensed, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. Boy, you are cruel, but we are not done with this matter. After Lin Yu heard what King Joyu said, he stared at King Joyu with a smile on his face, a bit of murderous intent flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Really? Then come and tell me why the two of us are not done yet. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he rushed directly in front of King Joyu and grabbed his neck without saying a word. At this time, King Joyu frantically slapped Lin Yu's shoulders and arms, with a look of complete fear in the corners of his eyes and brows. Let me go quickly, let me go quickly. At this time, the formation suddenly activated, and then a soft light immediately enveloped Lin Yu completely. At this time, Lin Yu's face froze slightly, and a bit of confusion flashed across the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. How is this possible? How is this possible? After Lin Yu said this, his face changed slightly, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. Then he took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. At this time, Lin Yu could clearly see the desolation in Lin Yu's eyes. King Guzhu ducked to Lin Yu's side, with a hint of fear in his eyes. What should we do? What should we do now? At this time, Lin Yu turned his head after hearing King Guzhu say this, and glanced in his direction. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a hint of confusion flashed in his eyes. Playful color. What do you think? After hearing what Lin Yu said, the king of Guzhu couldn't help but take a breath of cold air. At this time, he was indeed quite panicked. Isn't there nothing you can do? King Guzhu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. There was a kind of panic in the corners of his eyes and brows, and the bitter smile at the corners of his mouth became even more intense. It became obvious. Lin Yu gently patted King Guzhu on the shoulder. I am thinking about a question now. If I kill your brother, will you come to me for revenge? Lin Yu said this, staring at King Guzhu with a smile, and there was a playful look in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, King Guzhu's face sank slightly after hearing what Lin Yu said, and his face began to look a little ugly. At this time, he gritted his teeth. If he is unkind, don't blame me for being unjust. Since he wants me to die, why should I let him live? At this time, after hearing what King Guzhu said, Lin Yu couldn't help laughing, and there was a bit of mockery in his eyes. Are you serious? At this time, Lin Yu stared at King Guzhu with a smile on his face, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. King Guzhu nodded gently. Of course, otherwise, if we work together to kill him now, maybe we can find a way to break this formation. What do you think? Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 314. At this time, Lin Yu half closed his eyes and glanced at King Zhou Yu coldly, with a playful smile on his lips and a hint of teasing in his eyes. I think this question is good. It can really be like this. Lin Yu stared at King Zhou Yu with a smile on his face, and even King Zhou Yu couldn't figure out what Lin Yu wanted to do for a moment. King Zhou Yu narrowed his eyes into a slit, and then glanced at the two of them lightly, with a look of disdain and contempt. Don't think that you can kill me now that you have controlled me, boy. I told you that you are still young if you want to kill me. After King Zhou Yu finished speaking, his voice suddenly became cold and fierce, and the murderous intent in his eyes gave people a gloomy, cold, and fierce feeling. At this time, Lin Yu's face was slightly surprised, because he could clearly feel that this King Zhou Yu seemed not to be the previous King Zhou Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Zhou Yu. At this time, his eyes narrowed into a slit, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Really? I can't kill you. Ha ha ha, you are dreaming, and you will know what it means to kill you like a dog. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he rushed up, and without saying a word, he swung his fist and hit King Zhou Yu heavily. His eyes were full of a gloomy and cold color. At this time, King Zhou Yu saw this scene, and his pupils suddenly enlarged, and a bit of surprise flashed in his eyes. At this time, he couldn't help but take a deep breath and calm down his mood a little. This little guy seems to be quite capable, and the white tiger behind him doesn't look good either. The voice that came out of King Zhou Yu's mouth was completely different from the original one. After King Guzhu and Lin Yu looked at each other, Lin Yu shook his head and smiled. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect you to devour his soul so impatiently, but it's a pity that you might die here today. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Guzhu. At this time, King Guzhu was shocked after hearing what Lin Yu said, and then he turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a complicated smile on his lips. Why are you saying this to me? At this time, Lin Yu slowly walked towards King Guzhu, his eyes fixed on King Guzhu. A murderous intent was quietly released, and a bit of gloom flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Why am I going to tell you? Then come and tell me, why am I going to tell you? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Guzhu, and the murderous intent on his body was quietly released. The cold murderous aura seemed to have condensed into substance. The King Guzhu subconsciously took a few steps back, and there was a look of fear in his eyes and eyebrows. I warn you, it's best not to come over. If you dare to come over, dare. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Guzhu, and a faint smile appeared on the corners of his mouth, and the murderous intent on his body was even more awe-inspiring. What if you dare to go over? What can you do to me? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on King Guzhu. At this time, he suddenly rushed to King Guzhu with a step, and then grabbed King Guzhu's neck. At this time, the king of Guzhu simply stopped pretending. He just smiled slightly, his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. Little guy, I didn't expect you to be so capable, but it's a pity. What can you do with these abilities? You're still going to die. The king of Guzhu's tone suddenly became gloomy and cold at the end. At this moment, the murderous intent in him was overwhelming. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the murderous aura seemed to condense into substance. Lin Yu never thought that the king of Guzhu's murderous intent was so obvious, but at this moment, he did not have the slightest fear. Alas, the real purpose is revealed. I knew you had no good intentions, but I didn't expect you to be like this. King Guzhu stared at Lin Yu with a gloomy look in his eyes, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. What do I look like? At this time, Lin Yu heard King Guzhu say this, turned his head, stared at him, and a murderous aura spread quietly. What do you think? At this time, Lin Yu almost gritted his teeth and said this, and the gloomy look in his eyes was like the surging rivers and lakes. The king Guzhu subconsciously took a few steps back and barely stabilized his body. At this time, he realized how terrible Lin Yu was. Just a look made him feel the fear that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. King Guzhu stared at Lin Yu, but after a moment, he suddenly laughed. He laughed happily at this time, as if he had encountered the funniest joke in the world, and laughed wildly. Ha ha ha, interesting, it's really interesting, little guy, today I can give you a chance to kneel down and admit your mistakes to me. After hearing what King Guzhu said, Lin Yu half closed his eyes, turned around and glared at King Guzhu coldly, with a gloomy look in his eyes, and the murderous intent on his body quietly emerged. Interesting, you give me a chance to kneel down and admit my mistakes? Really? After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards King Guzhu. His speed was extremely fast, and he had arrived in front of Lin Yu in just a moment. King Guzhu stared at Lin Yu with a cold light in his eyes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 315. At this moment, after hearing King Guzhu say this, Lin Yu turned around and glanced in his direction, a bit of contempt flashed in his eyes, and the murderous aura quietly emerged in his body. Out. You really think you can defeat me now, do you? Put away your ridiculous naivete, it's so ridiculous. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes and brows were full of mockery, and the corners of his mouth were even more sneer-like. He was filled with murderous aura and murderous intent. At this time, after the king of Guzhu heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a few flashes in his eyes. The color was very complicated, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Boy, you have murderous intentions towards me now. Logically speaking, I can't keep you, but you are indeed a talent. If I kill you, it will be really unbearable. How about surrendering to me? At this time, King Guzhu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a hint of ridicule flashing in his eyes, and a hint of sneer at the corner of his mouth. At this time, when Lin Yu heard what King Guzhu said, he turned around and looked at King Guzhu coldly, with a slight sneer on his lips. Submit to you? Are you talking nonsense? Do you think I might become your lackey willingly? At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at the king of Guzhu, with a completely cold look in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the king of Guzhu suddenly laughed like this, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu. Okay, very good, very good. Since you want to seek death, you will be somewhat unjustifiable if I don't succeed. Today I will let you know what the price is. After the king of Guzhu finished speaking, he suddenly broke away from Lin Yu's shackles. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's pupils suddenly enlarged, and a bit of excitement flashed in his eyes. Incredible! How is this possible? At this time, The king of Guzhu stared at Qin Yu with a smile on his face. Nothing is impossible. Darling, you will die. At this time, King Guzhu let out an angry roar, and then rushed directly towards Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu didn't say anything and just flew up with a kick, and then he felt that his ankle was gripped so hard by the ancient King Zhou. Lin Yu's face was slightly condensed. At this time, his face began to look a little ugly. He wanted to desperately break free from the shackles of King Zhou. No matter how he broke free, he still couldn't break free. Lin Yu just took a breath of cold air. At this time, a bit of surprise flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu's brows were like this, as if they were twisted together. How is this possible? At this time, the king of Guzhu stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face. Little guy, I have already told you that you will never be my opponent. You will die no matter what today. The Guzhu king almost said this through gritted teeth, but after Lin Yu heard what the Guzhu king said, he just spread his hands so gently, and a somewhat contemptuous smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting, but do you think you can defeat me now? Lin Yu turned around and stared directly at King Guzhu. For some reason, King Guzhu suddenly had a somewhat ominous premonition in his heart. At this time, he turned his head and looked towards Lin Yu, glanced this way. What do you mean? I don't believe you can have a backup plan. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly saw an extremely mysterious and obscure curse seal drawn in front of him. At this time, his eyes were staring directly at the king of Guzhu, and the corners of his mouth were also. It evoked a somewhat mocking smile. If you don't believe it, it can only prove your stupidity, but it can't prove anything else. Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. After he finished speaking, he suddenly opened his eyes, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body surged, and a cold murderous aura suddenly moved towards Guzhu. The king is coming. That sinister aura caused King Guzhu to let go of his hand. King Guzhu moved forward one after another and took several steps back before he managed to stabilize his figure with reluctance. At this moment, he stared at Lin Yu with a horrified look on his face. His eyes were filled with a kind of panic. At this moment, she looked like this in shock. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu had a slight sneer on his lips, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. How? At this moment, the king of Guzhu slowly stabilized his figure. A cold look flashed in his eyes. After a while, he wiped away the blood on the corner of his mouth. You are quite capable, boy. You really impress me. At this time, after hearing what King Guzhu said, Lin Yu couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. Actually, it's okay, but this person is probably stronger than you, that's not a little bit. But there is one thing that really makes me admire you. After hearing what Lin Yu said, King Guzhu's face condensed slightly, and then he turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu fiercely. Interesting, then you can tell me what happened that caught you off guard. You are vicious. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards King Guzhu. Almost in an instant, the distance between the two people became less than 10 feet. At this time, King Guzhu felt Lin Yu's breath and couldn't help but shook his head and smiled. What do you know, you ridiculous guy? At this time, the viciousness in King Guzhu's words was fully revealed. Lin Yu retreated several steps in succession before he managed to stabilize his body with difficulty. At this time, he gently wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a fierce look flashed in his eyes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 316. At this time, King Guzhu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. Lin Yu's eyes also flashed a bit of gloom. At this time, he stood up slowly, and then he gently wiped away the blood from the corner of his mouth. At this time, Lin Yu stared at King Guzhu with a smile, and there was a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. This clay bodhisattva still has a third degree of anger, not to mention that the king of Guzhu is such a person who is determined to retaliate. At this time, the king of Guzhu, after seeing Lin Yu like this, turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu, and the murderous intention was quietly released. Interesting, little guy, you seem to be very unconvinced, but I really like your unconvinced look, because only by stepping on people like you can I experience an unprecedented pleasure. At this time, King Guzhu was staring at Lin Yu, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, when Lin Yu heard King Guzhu say this, his eyes were full of mockery, and then he shook his head. You, that's all. Anyway, I don't understand who gave you the courage to be so arrogant and domineering like me. At this time, King Guzhu was furious after hearing what Lin Yu said. He let out a low roar, and his eyes were filled with a gloomy look. Boy, since you want to die. If so, then it would really be a bit unjustifiable for you if I don't fulfill it, so I will fulfill it for you today. After King Guzhu finished speaking, he exerted a slight force in his palm. At this moment, Lin Yu had to admit that this King Zhou was indeed somewhat powerful. At this moment, he only felt that it was as if someone had suddenly strangled his throat. Lin Yu even felt that it was difficult to breathe. At this time, King Guzhu stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face. How is it? Are you still comfortable? At this time, King Yu of Zhou suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu, because King Yu of Zhou had already sacrificed his soul to those evil beasts, which was equivalent to King Yu of Zhou just being those alien beasts. Just a puppet of the beast. Now that King Yu of Zhou is controlled by the King of Guzhu using secret methods, even those evil beasts have no way to defeat King Yu of Zhou. So at this time, they simply gave up their plan to control King Zhou Yu. At this time, King Zhou Yu was controlled by others like a walking zombie, and he looked quite pitiful. At this time, Lin Yu also knew that he would be unable to deal with the King of Guzhu with He Lu Yu alone. At this time, Lin Yu just shook his head, and then sighed quietly. Well, since you want to die, it's really my fault if I don't help you. Be good and accept death. Lin Yu said through gritted teeth, his eyes a little cold, and his expression began to become ferocious. After the King of Guzhu saw Lin Yu in this state, his expression froze slightly, and he suddenly had a somewhat ominous premonition in his heart. He subconsciously took a few steps back. Boy, what do you want to do? I advise you to calm down, otherwise don't blame me for being rude to you. At this time, Lin Yu gently spread his hands, smiled, and then shook his head. You're not polite to me? You don't deserve it? Lin Yu just whispered softly from his mouth, White Tiger, come out. As soon as Lin Yu finished speaking, everyone heard a roar of a tiger. The roar of the tiger almost shook the human soul out completely. The face of the King of Guzhu changed drastically, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. His eyes stared straight like this. He stared at Lin Yu curiously. How is this possible? How is this possible? At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. It's an honor for you to die under this white tiger. I'm afraid you may not be able to see such a chaotic beast in your life. Even if it is a chaotic beast of your time, it has already retired to seclusion. Come into this forest. What Lin Yu said was indeed true. Even in the Battle of the Gods that year, this chaotic level beast did not appear at all. So at this time, King Guzhu's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then he frowned slightly. Boy, you are quite capable. Even I have to admit that you are indeed quite powerful, but so what? If you want to do anything to me, you are still not ready. At this moment, the white tiger was standing high above the void. His eyes were condescending, and when he saw these young people, the corners of his eyes and brows were full of contempt and disdain. So when he heard the Guzhu king say this, his face suddenly turned ugly. At this time, the white tiger let out a tiger roar from his mouth. At this time, the corners of Baihu's eyes and brows were filled with a gloomy look. You actually don't take me seriously. I will definitely eat your bones today. After the white tiger finished speaking, it suddenly rushed towards the king of Guzhu. At this time, the king of Guzhu was controlling the nine heavens black feather of King Zhouyu, and on the other side, he was controlling his own green lion. The two sides suddenly collided with each other. Even this space seemed to be trembling faintly. The offensives of the two sides were open and closed. In a moment, in a breath, it was natural and cold. After the two sides collided with each other, perhaps because the white tiger gave most of its soul power to Lin Yu, so at the beginning, the white tiger even fell into this disadvantage when it collided with it. At this time, after seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a few strange colors, and after a moment, he gritted his teeth. Damn it, how could their strength be so terrifying? What on earth is going on? At this moment, Lin Yu was like a confused monk, bewildered. His expression froze slightly, and then he made hand gestures and chanted a spell. A powerful and vast force was suddenly released. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Chang. Chapter 317. Just a moment later, the white tiger's decline became more and more obvious. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu knew that this kind of thing could not be allowed to continue like this, so her face sank slightly at this time, and then her mind was in a state of mind. A mysterious and strange power gushed out from his palm. Then the time and space beast was summoned by him. At this time, the face of the king of Guzhu was also slightly moved. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then he drilled into his fist and gritted his teeth. Asshole, how could I forget that this bastard still has such a trump card in his hand? This time and space beast looks very powerful. What should I do now? At this time, Bao Si slowly woke up. Bao Si, with a beautiful appearance, was wearing a veil, but her looming posture was even more attractive. The king of Guzhu looked at Bao Si, and his mind was moved at just one glance. The most taboo thing for masters to fight is probably distraction. So at this moment, the moment the king of Guzhu was distracted, Lin Yu called the space-time beast to launch the space-time tearing. At this time, the space around Jushin Xuanyi and Qingxi was instantly torn apart by the surging and overbearing power, which wanted to completely pull them into the void. At this time, a woman also walked in slowly. Who else could this woman be but Zhuang Yudi? Zhuang Yudi did not go back with the Dragon Country team at the beginning. At this time, Zhuang Yudi's eyes were staring straight at the king of Guzhu in the void. When the king of Guzhu saw Zhuang Yudi, it was as if he saw a life-saving straw. Save me! In fact, the king of Guzhu had already inserted Zhuang Yudi into the team of the Dragon Country, and he had people in every team of the country. It can be said that the king of Guzhu was really deliberate, but it was a pity that he would never have thought that Lin Yu would happen. At this time, Zhuang Yudi just had a sneer on his face. But just this sneer made the king of Guzhu feel like he was falling into an ice cave. At this time, the king of Guzhu suddenly realized that Zhuang Yudi's smile seemed a little weird, and his eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and there was a confusion in his eyes and eyebrows. Why don't you do it? Zhuang Yudi covered her face and giggled, her eyes flashed with a bit of charm. What do you think? Of course, I have already cracked your poisonous insect, so I am indifferent. Zhuang Yudi said in a cold voice. Her eyes and eyebrows were full of gloom, and her killing intent suddenly rose. When the king of Guzhu saw this scene, his face suddenly became ugly, and at this time, he was like falling into an ice cave. The king of Guzhu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood. You. Zhuang Yudi's mouth corners also curled up a sneer. What do you mean by me? It's ridiculous, dear, die. After Zhuang Yudi finished speaking, She immediately exerted force with both hands, and then a mysterious and strange force was suddenly released from her palms. Bao Si seemed to vaguely remember what happened before. She stared at King Guzhu with her eyes fixed, and then a bit of gloom flashed in her eyes. "You killed your brother." After Bao Si finished speaking, a stream of black ice energy penetrated King Guzhu's heart from his fingertips. King Guzhu was attacked by these two forces and just wanted to use his power to resist, but at this moment, the white tiger suddenly pounced towards Guzhou, and then opened its bloody mouth and swallowed King Guzhu in one bite. At this moment, King Guzhu let out a scream, and then died. To say that King Guzhu is really pitiful, but this pitiful person must have something hateful. After King Guzhu died, Lin Yu also slowly fell to the ground, but at this moment, his face was pale because of the huge consumption. Of course, all this was pretended. In fact, he could adjust his breath by himself. But Lin Yu didn't do that, because Lin Yu wanted to see what the two women wanted to do. If he was strong enough now, the two women would not dare to do anything. This was not what Lin Yu wanted to see. As expected, Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si slowly walked towards Lin Yu. At this time, Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si stood opposite each other. However, the two women were smart women. They knew that now was not the time for internal fighting, so they did not fight each other. At this time, the two of them came to Lin Yu's side. Then they helped Lin Yu up on the left and right. "Do you have a way to get out?" Zhuang Yudi glanced at Bao Si, and then someone asked. At this time, Bao Si couldn't help but frown slightly and shook her head. "At the moment, there really isn't. The mechanisms here are too complicated. There's no way I can crack the mechanisms here." At this time, Zhuang Yudi's eyes clearly flashed with a hint of sadness. At this time, she glanced at Lin Yu. "I can't get out of this room. I've been walking around here for a long time. Here. The room is too mysterious and weird. Every once in a while, no matter where I am, I will always be transported to this place." After Lin Yu heard what Zhuang Yudi said, the corners of his mouth raised slightly with a sinister arc, and a trace of teasing flashed in his eyes. "I have a solution." At this time, Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si were there. After the two of them heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of excitement clearly flashed through their eyes, and then their eyes stared straight at each other. Staring at Lin Yu. "Is there anything you can do to tell me quickly?" At this time, Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si looked extremely excited. Lin Yu heard this. After the two of them finished speaking, the corners of their mouths also curled up with a hint of evil. At this moment, he heard him softly spit out 3 words from his mouth: "Time and Space Beast." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 318. It is indeed good. This place seems to take advantage of the loops of this space. Therefore, if ordinary people want to come in, it is absolutely impossible unless they find the right space node. However, it is not easy to find that space-time node. And not only that, the space in this place is very mysterious and complex. It is not just a simple loop, but the most important point is probably that the time and space here can absorb the spiritual power of others. Therefore, ordinary people cannot stay here for too long. If they stay too long, something will definitely happen. When Lin Yu thought of this, a bit of joking flashed in his eyes. There was indeed no way for an ordinary person to escape easily, but Lin Yu was not an ordinary person. He had a space-time beast in him. Once with the help of the space beast, it is easy to get out. So when Lin Yu thought of this, the corners of his mouth raised slightly, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. "Just leave this matter to me." Lin Yu spoke softly and unhurriedly, and Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi glanced at him, with a bit of confusion flashing in their eyes. "What do you want to do?" At this time, Bao Si was staring straight at Lin Yu, with a look of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, the corners of Lin Yu's mouth raised slightly, with a hint of evil arc. I wonder if you have forgotten the time and space beast on me. After Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of excitement flashed in their eyes. At this time, they nodded gently, with a kind of excitement in the corners of their eyes and brows. That's right, you also have a space-time beast with you. The space-time beast can take us directly out of this space. This is indeed the only choice. At this time, Lin Yu nodded softly after hearing what Zhuang Yudi said. After waiting for a moment, the few of them escaped from that place. At this time, Bao Si's clothes were extremely thin. Even someone like Lin Yu, who was used to seeing beautiful women, had to admit that this woman was indeed attractive. At this time, Lin Yu turned around and glanced in Bao Si's direction. At this time, Bao Si also glanced in Lin Yu's direction. There was a bit of charm on Bao Si's face, and then she covered her face and let out a cute smile. What? Am I beautiful? At this time, Zhuang Yudi saw Bao Si like this, and for some reason, she felt a little unhappy in her heart for no reason. At this moment, Zhuang Yudi was heard muttering in a low voice. Tickling your head and posing. Bao Si seemed to have heard what Zhuang Yudi said and then turned around and glanced at Zhuang Yudi, with a faint smile on the corner of her mouth. It seems that my sister is very dissatisfied with me. I wonder where I have offended my sister. Bao Si's eyes were fixed directly on Zhuang Yudi, and a charming smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. At this time, Zhuang Yudi heard the praise. After saying this, she quickly waved her hand. No, my sister must have heard wrong just now. At this moment, when Lin Yu saw the two of them like this, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he shook his head and smiled. There's no such thing as a feast that lasts forever. Although a few of us met and had such experiences, I think it's time for us to say goodbye. At this time, Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi heard Lin Yu. After saying this, Bao Si's reaction was nothing special. She just nodded slightly. What you said is indeed true. It's really time for us to say goodbye. At this moment, Zhuang Yudi glanced at Lin Yu. A strange color flashed in her eyes, and then she frowned slightly. No, you can't leave now. At this time, Lin Yu heard Zhuang Yudi. After saying this, there was a bit of confusion in his eyes. Then he turned his head and glanced at Zhuang Yudi. He frowned slightly. Frowned. I wonder what the girl means by this. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi. At this time, Zhuang Yudi gritted his teeth and came to Lin Yu as if he had made up his mind. I beg you, sir, to do me a favor, and please don't refuse. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he smiled slightly. There's nothing wrong with this, but can you tell me what you want me to do? At this moment, Lin Yu turned around and stared directly at Zhuang Yudi, with complex colors flashing in his eyes. At this time, Zhuang Yudi just smiled. I hope you can come with me to Castle William. Of course, if this sister has nowhere to go for the time being, she can also come with me. At this time, Lin Yu heard Zhuang Yudi. After saying this, he turned his head and stared at her directly. Give me a reason. When Zhuang Yudi heard Lin Yu say this, a look of helplessness flashed in her eyes, and she gritted her teeth after a moment. It will be good for you after you go. Lin Yu thought that he had nothing to do anyway, so it would be okay to go, so he nodded gently and agreed. However, he was called Lin Yu, and he never expected that Bao Si actually agreed to Zhuang Yudi's request. The group chose a place to stay nearby for a few days, and then Zhuang Yudi arranged the plane, and the group boarded the plane. When they boarded the plane and took off, a group of people rushed out directly, holding hot weapons in their hands, and quickly controlled the situation. At this time, Lin Yu always felt that this matter seemed to be a conspiracy, so he did not do it at first, but let them do it. At this time, Lin Yu raised a few meaningful smiles at the corners of his mouth. Bao Si's appearance was so beautiful that she soon attracted several people. Their eyes were fixed on Bao Si, looking up and down, and their eyes were full of greed. At this moment, Lin Yu heard a noisy sound coming from the captain's room. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 319. At this time, a man walked directly to Zhuang Yudi. The man picked up Zhuang Yudi's chin with a gun. Interesting, this girl is really interesting. At this time, they even noticed Bao Si. At this time, a man came directly to Bao Si. The man slowly pressed his gun against Bao Si's chin, and then gently lifting it up. At this time, a cold light flashed in Bao Si's eyes. Lin Yu winked crazily at Bao Si, but he also knew what kind of temper Bao Si had. Oh, these poor guys can't provoke anyone, but they want to provoke Bao Si. They are simply looking for death. Lin Yu stood up slowly as he spoke. When the robbers saw Lin Yu standing up, they raised their guns and fired wildly at Lin Yu. Damn it, you actually dare to provoke us like this. It seems it's time to send you to see God. At this time, the cabin was instantly penetrated by these robbers. Bao Si suddenly stood up and drew a mysterious symbol in front of her, and then a few more coins came out of her body from unknown time, and those coins penetrated the robbers' bodies like bullets. Head. The cabin fell silent for a moment, and everyone looked at each other with a look of admiration. When Lin Yu saw this scene, he just shook his head and smiled. You probably won't go to heaven. I hope you won't be so stupid as to provoke those you shouldn't provoke in hell. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he walked towards the captain's cabin. Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi followed closely behind. When Lin Yu walked to the hatch, he turned his head and glanced at Kong Cheng. Tell me now, is there any way to open this door now? The flight attendant was frightened at first. Bao Si touched her forehead so lightly, and the flight attendant came back to her senses in an instant. There is no way to open this. To be precise, there is no way to open it from the outside. After the flight attendant explained the reason to Lin Yu, 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead. Originally, this was designed to prevent hijacking, but now, it has become the biggest obstacle to their efforts to save people. Bao Si took a step forward. Leave it to me. Lin Yu smiled, no, leave it to me. It shouldn't be a problem to teleport through this wall. Lin Yu knew how powerful Bao Si's move was, and he was very afraid that even if Bao Si could break through the door, he would also injure the captain inside. So at this time, Lin Yu walked to the door of the room, and then with a thought in his mind, he instantly disappeared in front of everyone. 2 robbers accidentally shot and killed the captain. Shit, damn it, why did you kill him? Do you know you killed him? How should we land? The great God wants sacrifices, not living people. After the man finished speaking, his other companion understood that this man probably had no intention of going back alive from the moment he came. Madman, you madman, if I had known earlier, I shouldn't have accompanied you to go crazy. The man slowly walked up to him and stared at him with a smile on his face. My dear Bruce, only sacrifice can make the gods feel our love for him. Yes, what he said is indeed true. Only death can let Satan taste the delicious taste of blood. After George heard Lin Yu's words, his face was filled with excitement. That's right, brother, I didn't expect the 2 of us to be so in love. After George finished speaking, he turned his head, and then he saw an unfamiliar face. At this time, Bruce and George raised their submachine guns at the same time, and Lin Yu smiled and shook his head. Stupid guys, you shouldn't raise a gun against your god. The 2 people didn't understand what Lin Yu meant, but then a cold light flashed, and then a line of blood appeared on their necks at the same time. At this time, the two of them fell straight down. Lin Yu quickly opened the cabin door from the captain's cabin. The flight attendant, Bao Si, and Zhuang Yudi walked in at the same time. When the flight attendant saw that the captain and co-pilot were both killed, she suddenly collapsed on the ground. It's over, it's completely over this time. The captain and co-pilot are both dead, and no one can control the plane. An evil smile appeared at the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, who said no. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he sat in the captain's seat. He glanced at the route, and then frowned. This destination seems to have been tampered with. This place seems to be in a strait in country M. Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si frowned slightly. However, Lin Yu didn't say much. He just changed the route and began to concentrate on controlling the plane. After they got off the plane, everyone was looking for the hero who saved them, but at this time Chen Chen had already left directly with Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si. In William's castle, a man in a medieval tuxedo, holding a glass of red wine, and then a man who looked like a butler walked in. "Master, they are here." William drank the wine in his hand. "Very good, it's good that they are here." William went out to greet them. After Lin Yu and William hugged each other. William didn't even arrange dinner first, and took them directly to the back garden. There was a bottomless black hole in the back garden. Outside the black hole, Lin Yu saw a broken statue. At this time, Lin Yu's brows were twisted together. When he rushed to the garden, he smelled a familiar smell. "Sir, I don't know why, but in my ancestral home, there is always a woman crying in the middle of the night. I don't know why, so I specially invited you here. I hope you can take a look." Lin Yu smiled. "I don't know if you have heard of an old saying in our dragon country." After hearing what Lin Yu said, William raised his eyebrows slightly. "I don't know what the old saying is. Please enlighten me, sir." Lin Yu suddenly smiled. "That saying is that the person who tied the bell can only untie it." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 320. At this time, William scratched his head after hearing what Lin Yu said. A bit of confusion flashed in his eyes. At this time, his eyes were staring at Lin Yu, and then he continued to make up. Just frowned slightly. "Mr. Lin, what do you mean? Why can't I understand you?" At this time, William's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu. A bit of confusion flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he shook his head. "I still don't quite understand. I hope sir can make it clear." William's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu. At this moment, after hearing what William said, Lin Yu raised the corners of his mouth slightly, arousing a bit of amusement. "I have made it very clear to you just now. To untie the bell, you need someone to tie it. This matter must have something to do with you. Is it possible that you still don't understand?" Lin Yu's eyes were like the eyes of an eagle, staring directly at William. At this moment, after William heard what Lin Yu said, his eyes were dodgy, and something strange flashed across the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "Color. This." At this time, when Lin Yu saw William like this, a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "What is this? If I guessed correctly, there should be a life on your hands." At this time, after William heard what Lin Yu said, his expression suddenly froze, and then he frowned slightly and shook his head. "What do you mean by this? I don't understand." After Lin Yu heard what William said, he felt a little angry. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on William. "If you continue like this, I won't be able to help you at all." At this time, William heard Lin Yu. After saying this, he just slumped down on the ground, his eyes were dull, and there was a bit of a bitter smile at the corners of his mouth. There was a kind of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Meaning, "Mr. Lin, I can indeed tell you this matter, but you must also agree to one condition." After Lin Yu heard what William said, a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and then he turned his head and glanced in his direction, with a strange color flashing in his eyes. "Tell me, what conditions do you want me to agree to?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on William. At this time, his eyes were burning and his eyes were like torches. William just sighed faintly. "Oh, what else can it be? Of course it is to help me keep the secret. You have to promise me that you can't tell it." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what William said, he nodded slightly, and then others turned their heads and glanced in William's direction. "Okay, I can agree to the conditions you mentioned, but you have to sincerely repent, and then follow me to take a look underground and take a walk." At this time, after William heard what Lin Yu said, he nodded so heavily, and the two of them had reached a consensus. On the side, Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi were in a state of confusion while listening to their conversation. At this time, the two of them were like 2-foot-tall monks, confused and completely confused. What is going on? At this time, Zhuang Yudi also took a step forward, and then stared directly at the two of them, with a bit of confusion flashing in the corners of his eyes and brows. "I don't understand what you two mean by what you said. It's a bit strange." At this time, Lin Yu and William just looked at each other, and then Lin Yu glanced at Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si. "You two, please step back, I will wait for a while to handle this matter, I'll tell you the answer." Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly. Zhuang Yudi and Bao Si were also slightly startled after hearing what Lin Yu said, but then they nodded lightly. "If that's the case, then fine, I won't say anything more." At this time, the two of them looked at each other, and then Lin Yu took the lead. After William saw Lin Yu walking down, he gritted his teeth like this, and a trace of determination flashed in his eyes. As if he had made such a big decision, he just walked down. At this time, Lin Yu, after seeing William like this, had a few meaningful smiles on his lips, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. "What? Unwilling?" William shook his head. "You know, of course not." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what William said, he just sighed leisurely, and then smiled like this. "I'm curious why you did that in the first place." Lin Yu turned his head as he spoke, his eyes staring straight at William, with a gloomy meaning in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, William seemed to be stunned for a moment, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Do you think I have a way or a choice? That woman keeps forcing me, and you don't know that in a family like ours, there are too many things that I can't help myself, so I have no choice or choice." At this time, William paused immediately after saying this. At this time, his face flashed with a hint of seclusion, and then he fell into a look of memories. "Oh, I just remember the beginning. That woman found my father, and my father received her very friendly, but she was too dissatisfied. My father promised that he could give her a considerable amount of alimony, and every day in the future I would give her a regular payment every month, but she refused. There was nothing I could do, so I had no choice but to kill her." When William said the last word, his expression seemed to freeze instantly. At this time, his expression began to slowly become ferocious. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but shake his head, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "She is carrying your child in her belly, how could you do it?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at William, and at this time, William was also laughing so hard, as if he was going crazy.